For 13 days in October 1962, the United States military sat at DEFCON 2, one step below nuclear war. It was the first time in American history that the alert level had ever been reached. It has never been reached since. Bomber crews sat in their planes on runways, engines running, waiting for an order that would send them toward the Soviet Union. Submarines carrying nuclear weapons disappeared beneath the Atlantic, cut off from communication, operating on their own judgment. In Florida, 100,000 troops assembled for an invasion of Cuba. Everyone who knew the full picture, and there weren't many, believed they might not see November. And then quietly it was over. The version you were taught. Kennedy stared Khrushchev down. The Soviets blinked. America won. That version? A lie. Both governments agreed to tell it. The Kennedy administration denied what actually happened for over 25 years, through multiple presidencies, until declassified documents and secret White House recordings proved otherwise. By the time the full story came out, most of the men in the room were already dead. What actually ended the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't a staring contest. It was a trade, and one Soviet submarine officer, a man whose name you probably don't know, is the reason you're alive right now. The missiles in Cuba weren't the first move. They were an answer. And to understand the answer, you have to understand the question America had already asked loudly 2 years earlier. April 1961. The CIA launches the Bay of Pigs invasion. Cuban exiles trained in Florida land on the southern coast of Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. It fails within days, humiliatingly. Kennedy is embarrassed publicly, but Castro, now deeply paranoid, draws one conclusion. A real American invasion is only a matter of time. He turns to Moscow for protection. Behind the scenes, the U.S. escalates. Operation Mongoose. A sprawling campaign of sabotage, propaganda, paramilitary raids, and multiple assassination attempts, all aimed at destabilizing Castro's government. The CIA ran training camps. They burned sugar fields. They attempted to infiltrate the Cuban military. To anyone watching from Moscow, it looked like the prelude to a full invasion. Khrushchev watches this unfold and draws his own conclusion. If America is willing to try toppling a communist government 90 miles from Florida, what stops it from trying it in Eastern Europe? So he decides to level the playing field. Here's the detail almost nobody knows. In 1961, the US had placed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Turkey, right on the Soviet Union's southern border. Flight time to Moscow, measured in single-digit minutes. These missiles were a public fact. Everyone knew about them. They were the exact same threat Cuba would later pose to America. Khrushchev saw the deployment in Cuba as simple reciprocity. If you can park nuclear missiles on my border, I can park nuclear missiles on yours. The logic was identical. The difference? America's missiles were already there openly deployed. The Soviet missiles in Cuba were being installed in secret until October 14, 1962, when a U-2 spy plane flew over and caught them in the act. The photographs stopped the CIA cold. Medium-range ballistic missiles, nuclear warheads, 90 miles from Florida. Flight time to Washington, D.C. under 20 minutes. Kennedy understood immediately. If the public knew the missiles had been discovered before he had a plan, the pressure would be unbearable. So he assembled a small group of advisors, ExComm, the executive committee, and for 13 days they debated what to do in almost total secrecy. The obvious options were all terrible. Full invasion. Could trigger Soviet retaliation in Berlin. Would kill Soviet personnel. Uncontrollable escalation. Airstrikes. The Joint Chiefs pushed hard for this. But you couldn't guarantee hitting every missile site, and even one surviving nuclear warhead aimed at Miami was unacceptable. Do nothing. Unthinkable. Nuclear weapons sitting minutes from American cities. Kennedy chose option 4. A naval blockade. He called it a quarantine, because legally, a blockade is an act of war. On October 22nd, he went on national television and told the American public what the CIA had found. Soviet ships loaded with military supplies were already heading toward Cuba. Nobody knew if they would stop or try to cross the line. United States forces moved to DEFCON 2. Bomber crews sat in there. Planes on standby. Submarines carrying nuclear weapons waited at sea. Most of the Soviet ships slowed down or turned back. One did not. For a tense stretch of hours, two superpowers drifted closer to war. Not because anyone wanted it, but because no one knew how to stop it without losing. But before any deal could be made, the world nearly ended. October 27, 1962. Black Saturday. The single most dangerous day in human history. 3 things happened within hours that could have triggered nuclear war, and none of them were intentional. 1. A U-2 was shot down over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed. Kennedy's military advisors demanded immediate airstrikes in retaliation for the missile sites. Kennedy held them off. Barely. 2. Another U-2 accidentally flew into Soviet airspace over Siberia. Soviet fighters scrambled to intercept. If that plane had been shot down over Russia itself, the escalation would have been automatic. It wasn't, but only because the pilot realized his mistake in time and turned back. But those weren't the closest calls. The closest call was underwater, where nobody could see it happening. A Soviet submarine, B-59, was hiding in the Caribbean. It had been cut off from communications for days. The crew had no idea whether war had already started. American destroyers detected the submarine and began dropping signaling depth charges. Non-lethal, meant to force the sub to the surface. But the crew of B-59 didn't know that. The temperature inside the submarine was over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide was building up. They hadn't heard from Moscow in days, and now explosions were going off above them. They believed war had already begun. The submarine captain, Valentin Savitsky, decided to launch a nuclear torpedo. Soviet protocol required all 3 senior officers to agree. 2 said yes. The third, Vasily Arkhipov, said no. 1 man, 1 vote. That's how close we came to nuclear war. Not because of a strategic decision in the White House or the Kremlin. Because a man in a metal tube at the bottom of the ocean, running out of air, running out of time, running out of reasons to believe the world above him still existed, decided not to end it. If Arkhipov had said yes, nobody would have known why. There would have been no investigation, no accountability. Just a flash in the Caribbean, followed by a sequence of retaliations that would have made the question irrelevant. While the world was still processing Black Saturday, a parallel conversation was already happening in rooms where no one was taking notes. Publicly, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a letter on October 26th. The offer was straightforward: remove the blockade, promise not to invade Cuba, and the Soviet missiles would come out. Reasonable. Something Kennedy could work with. But privately, through back-channel diplomacy, a second demand arrived: remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. This was the real negotiation, and Kennedy couldn't accept it publicly. Turkey was a NATO ally. Removing defensive missiles under Soviet pressure would fracture the alliance. It would look like America traded its allies' safety for its own. So Kennedy did something clever and morally complicated. He responded publicly, only to the first letter, accepted the no invasion pledge, ignored the Turkey demand entirely, and then he sent his brother Robert Kennedy to meet secretly with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin. The trade was simple. The U.S. would remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey quietly over 6 months, under the pretense of routine military modernization. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. Both sides would walk away. Neither would admit the full truth publicly. Khrushchev agreed. The crisis ended. But here's who nobody bothered to tell. Fidel Castro, whose own country was the entire reason for the crisis, was left out of the final negotiations completely. He found out the Soviet missiles were leaving Cuba from a radio broadcast. Not from Moscow, not from a phone call. From the radio, like everyone else. He was reportedly furious. His country had been turned into a bargaining chip in a negotiation between superpowers that had never really been about him at all. And Khrushchev? To the outside world, it looked like the Soviet Union had simply backed down. He'd been humiliated publicly. That perceived humiliation is considered one of the reasons he was removed from power just 2 years later. The person who didn't lose power? Kennedy. He was elevated, cast as a decisive Cold War warrior who had stood firm and won. And his administration went to work making sure nobody questioned that story. And that's when the second operation began. Not a military one, a narrative one. The Kennedy administration went to work rewriting what had just happened before anyone could ask the wrong questions. They briefed journalists on the victory narrative, deliberately framed the crisis as a test of wills rather than what it actually was. A negotiated compromise between 2 leaders who both understood exactly how close they'd come. They controlled which photographs were released, which details were emphasized, which questions were never asked. And then they denied the Turkey deal had ever happened. For over 25 years, through multiple presidencies, they kept the lie alive. Whenever the question came up in interviews and memoirs and congressional testimony, the answer was the same. There was no trade. Kennedy never agreed to remove the Jupiters. The crisis was resolved by American resolve, period. The truth didn't fully emerge until the late 1980s and early 1990s. Through declassified documents, interviews with aging ex-com members who had stopped caring about protecting a dead president's reputation, and the publication of secret White House recordings that Kennedy had made of his own meetings. The tapes proved what the administration had spent decades denying. By the time the full story came out, most of the men in the room were dead. Here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. The dynamics that almost ended the world in 1962 haven't gone anywhere. Leaders still need face-saving exits. Public narratives and private deals still rarely match. And the difference between war and peace still comes down to quiet conversations nobody reports on, and individuals like Vasily Arkhipov, who say no when everyone else says yes. The crisis did produce lasting change. Within months, the United States and the Soviet Union set up a direct phone line between Washington and Moscow, the hotline, so future crises could be resolved through fast conversation instead of slow, risky letters passed back and forth through intermediaries. The following summer, both countries signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, a small but real step back from the edge they had just stood on together. But the lesson that should keep you up at night isn't about treaties. It's about luck. A Soviet submarine, a depth charge nobody intended as an attack, a crew that believed war had already started, 2 officers who voted to launch, and 1 man, for reasons we'll never fully know, decided not to end the world. How many other moments like that have there been? How many times has someone somewhere said no and none of us ever found out? How many Archipovs, in submarines, in missile silos, in command centers whose names are still classified, have been the difference between the world you woke up in this morning and a world that doesn't exist? Not the version that makes leaders look decisive and history feel inevitable. The real one, messy, uncomfortable, populated by people whose names you never learned because the official story didn't need them. If that matters to you, subscribe. We're going to keep pulling at the threads. The official story is rarely the real one.